The summons arrived on a Tuesday, which was itself a small joke. Tuesdays at the Office of Interspecies Liaison were for filing. Specifically, they were for the kind of filing that nobody wanted to do on Monday because it made the week feel long, and nobody wanted to do on Wednesday through Friday because by then the week was already lost. Tuesday was the designated day for cross-referencing species classification amendments against the Master Accord Index, and I had been doing exactly that, cross-referencing, in silence, in a shared office that smelled of recycled air and old coffee. When attaché first class Bren Hollowell knocked on my door frame and told me we had been selected. I asked selected for what? He said the Vethek Accord Station assessment session. I said I didn't know, we had submitted a candidacy. He said we hadn't. I put down my stylus. Bren Hollowell was 43 years old and had spent 11 of those years at the Office of Interspecies Liaison, which was longer than anyone else currently assigned there, and longer than most people lasted before requesting a transfer to something with a window. He was not a dramatic person. He delivered information with the same flat affect whether it was good news or a fire alarm, and over 3 years of working for him, I had learned to read his silences as carefully as his words. The silence he was currently offering me was the particular kind that meant he was also confused and did not want to say so out loud. I asked how long we had to prepare. He said 8 days. I said that was less time than the standard preparation window. He said yes. He said the standard preparation window for a Vethek Accord Station assessment session was 42 days, and that normally an observer delegation of 4 attended, with 2 senior attachés and at least 1 cultural liaison officer, plus a translator team. I asked how many people we were sending. He looked at me steadily. I understood. It took me a moment to say anything after that, not because I was frightened. I would get to frightened later privately on my own time, but because I was doing arithmetic. 8 days, 2 people. A session before the Vareth Conclave, which was the 11-species administrative body that ran the Vethek Accord Station and set the terms under which non-member species were classified, granted access privileges, and occasionally reclassified into categories that meant you no longer had access privileges at all. They were, by any reasonable measure, one of the more powerful bureaucratic bodies in this sector of the galaxy. They met in a chamber designed to hold 40 delegations simultaneously. The ceiling was 60 meters high. I said all right. Bren said he would handle logistics. I said I would handle the documents. We did not discuss whether this was a good idea, because discussing it would have required one of us to say out loud that sending 2 people to the Vethek Accord assessment with 8 days' notice was not a good idea. And once you said that out loud, you would have to follow it up with a second thought, which was that we were being set up for something, and a third thought, which was that we were going anyway. I went back to my cross-referencing. The documents, as I came to understand over the following 6 days, were the whole game. The Vareth Conclave operated through a system of procedure that had been accumulating for approximately 400 years, layered over itself like sedimentary rock, each generation of conclave administrators adding new protocols on top of the old ones, without ever removing the old ones, because removing old protocols required a full conclave ratification vote, and full conclave ratification votes took 7 years, and nobody had 7 years to spare. The result was a document architecture of extraordinary complexity. To prepare for an assessment session, a delegation was expected to present credentials in a specific order, respond to procedural challenges in a specific sequence, and demonstrate familiarity with the applicable sections of the Accord Charter, which ran to approximately 42,000 pages in the standard translation, with several thousand additional pages of interpretive addenda that had accumulated since the original drafting. I had read approximately 11,000 of those pages before, in the course of my regular duties. I read the rest of them in 6 days. I am not saying this to impress anyone. I am saying it because it is a material fact about what happened in the session, and the way things go wrong in bureaucratic environments almost always comes down to someone not having read the relevant document. I kept notes, not casual notes, a working document cross-referenced to the Charter's own internal indexing system, which had its own evolution history layered into it. The original 400-year-old indexing conventions, 3 subsequent reindexing projects that had partially superseded one another, and a supplemental concordance that the Conclave's administrative staff had produced 80 years ago when they discovered the reindexing projects were inconsistent. Reading the Charter without the concordance was reading a city without a map. Reading the concordance without understanding the reindexing history was like reading a map drawn by 3 different cartographers who didn't speak to each other. I built my own working index in the margins of my notes, cross-referencing all 4 layers simultaneously. On the 4th day, I found Article 7, Paragraph 3. I had seen it before, in passing, during my standard duties. I had filed it in the back of my mind under foundational criteria, interesting but not relevant to current casework, which is where a lot of things end up when you are maintaining a working file for 60-odd species in various stages of classification. What I had not done, before those 6 days of preparation, was sit down and verify systematically which of those foundational criteria Earth actually met. I verified it 3 times before I told Bryn. The first verification was a straight read-through of the criteria against our status as I understood it. The second was a check against the Accord's own public registry. The commercial and transit records were accessible to any registered party, and I pulled every Earth entry and matched them against the specific language of the criteria one by one. The third verification was the uncomfortable one. I went back through all 4 indexing layers and confirmed that no subsequent amendment had quietly revised or superseded the foundational criteria in a way that would have changed the threshold. There had been interpretive addenda. There were always interpretive addenda, but none of them touched the 3 core criteria in paragraph 3. The criteria were, as originally drafted, the criteria. The part of my brain that handles that kind of confirmation was very quiet for a moment after the third verification. It is a specific feeling, finding something that large in a document. Not excitement, exactly. More like the feeling of stepping on a stair that turns out to be 2 inches lower than you expected. Everything is fine. You have not fallen, but the geometry of the room is now slightly different from what you thought it was. I also spent an afternoon confirming what had not happened, specifically, whether anyone at the office had flagged this before. I checked the filing record. No prior notes. I checked the standard annual summary reports, which were produced by the automated review system. The system had applied the current tier criteria to Earth's classification every year, which was technically correct procedure for the kind of review it was designed to run. The foundational criteria check was a different process, triggered only by specific circumstances that the automated system did not flag for this case, because the flagging logic had been written in a later stratum of the administrative architecture and used the amended indexing conventions rather than the foundational ones. In other words, the system had been looking at the right shelf, but not all the way to the back of it. I wrote that up in the supplemental notes when I found it, 8 months before the summons arrived. I filed it under a category I had labeled pending further review, which is what I labeled things I thought might matter eventually, but which I had no immediate occasion to act on. It sat there through 8 months of standard filing cycles. Then the summons arrived. He was at his desk, working through transit logistics when I came to his door with my notes. I said I'd found something in the cross-reference work. He put down what he was doing. I showed him the relevant pages. He read them slowly. He is a methodical reader and I did not rush him. When he finished, he sat back and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "How long?" I said 11 years, give or take a few months depending on which qualifying event you used as the benchmark. The permanent off-world installation, the Callahan Station at L2, had been operational for 14 years. The Accord Transit Corridor navigation had been continuous since we received our Provisional Associate classification. The interstellar trade relationships were logged in the Accord's own registry. The mineral exchange agreements with the PETH Consortium alone had been active for 11 years, and there were 4 additional commercial agreements on top of those. He said, and nobody noticed. I said it was a large document. I said the automated review process applied current tier criteria when generating assessment summaries, not foundational criteria checks. Foundational criteria were the kind of thing you only consulted if someone specifically raised the question, and nobody had raised the question because nobody had been reading all 4 layers of the index simultaneously. He said, until you. I said I'd had 6 days with nothing else to do. I did not mention the 8 months before that. There would be time for that conversation later. He allowed himself one very small, dry exhalation that was not quite a laugh. Then he said we would want to be careful about how we raised it. I said yes. I said we were not there to catch them in an error. We were there to contribute to the accuracy of their record. Those were very different positions, and how you framed them determined what kind of session you had. He said that was also well put. I said I'd start drafting the document. Bren handled logistics, which meant he handled the transit arrangements, the accommodation requests, and the formal notification to the Conclave's administrative registry that Earth's diplomatic representation would consist of Attaché First Class Bren Hollowell and Warrant Officer Second Class Deva Osai. I know how that looked on the notification form because I proofread it. It looked like a mistake. The Conclave's standard notification form had fields for senior delegate, deputy senior delegate, cultural liaison, translation lead, translation second, and additional staff, and we had filled in 2 of those fields and left the rest blank. The response from the Conclave's administrative registry arrived within 4 hours. It was politely worded, which in Conclave administrative correspondence is what you say when you mean it was so formal as to constitute a rebuke. It noted that Earth's delegation appeared to consist of fewer representatives than the standard minimum. It inquired as to whether the remaining personnel had been listed separately. It attached, as an enclosure, the relevant section of the Accord Charter specifying the composition requirements for an assessment delegation. I read the enclosure carefully. Then I read it again. Then I pulled the full text of the relevant charter section and read that. Then I wrote a very short response to the Conclave's administrative registry. I noted that Earth's delegation was complete as filed. I cited the relevant charter subsection, not the one they had sent, but a different one, from an earlier stratum of the document architecture, which specified that the composition requirements in the section they had cited applied specifically to delegations submitting new species classifications, not to delegations responding to an assessment summons. For a summoned delegation, the only requirement was the presence of at least one entity authorized to act on behalf of the summoned party. The reply from the administrative registry took 8 hours this time. It acknowledged my citation. It did not say anything else. Bren read the exchange over my shoulder and said nothing for a moment. Then he said that was well done. I said I hadn't done anything yet. He said no, but I'd drawn the shape of it. We shipped out the following morning. The Vethek Accord station was, from the outside, a thing that made you stop talking mid-sentence. I had seen images, but images do not communicate the specific quality of something that is enormous and also completely indifferent to your reaction to its enormousness. It was a ring structure approximately 40 kilometers in diameter, with a central hub and 12 spokes, each spoke terminating in an assessment and administrative complex. We were docked at Spoke 9. The docking bay alone was large enough to hold several city blocks. The walls were pale gray composite, with a faint blue spectrum light that gave everything a slightly formal quality, as though the station itself was conducting an assessment at all times, and you were simply one of the items under review. The escort met us at the docking ring. There were 6 of them, which was 2 more than the standard escort for an assessment delegation, and I noted that down to think about later. They were Varath, the dominant administrative species of the Conclave, and the one that staffed most of the station's procedural functions. Varath are chitinous, which is the word that gets used in the contact briefings and which does not quite do the job. They are tall. The tallest of the 6 escorts stood perhaps 1.5 meters above me, and they have 6 limbs, 4 of which function as arms in various configurations, and 2 of which are legs, though they move in a way that suggests the distinction between arm and leg is less fixed than it is for us. Their carapace has a quality of being both biological and architectural. It looks grown and also designed. The 2 escorts in the lead were wearing what I recognized as assessment session ceremonial carapace overlays, which are additional plates of worked composite fitted over the natural carapace in specific patterns that indicate rank and function within the conclave. They had been polished to a mirror finish. They were, in short, impressive. The 6 of them, with their ceremonial overlays and their clicking, fluid movement, filled the corridor with an atmosphere of serious institutional weight. We were 2 humans in dark travel suits carrying document cases. The lead escort made a sound that the translator rendered as a polite inquiry as to whether the remainder of our delegation would be following. Bren said we were complete. There was a pause, not a hostile pause, more the pause of someone recalculating. The lead escort's nearest pair of eyes, which are small and compound and positioned at the front of the head in a slight cluster, tracked briefly from Bren to me and back again. Then it said, translated, "Please follow." We followed. The corridors of Spoke 9 were long and high-ceilinged, lit with the same blue spectrum institutional light as the docking bay. We passed other delegations in transit, a group of 7 from a species I recognized by their silhouette as Peth Consortium observers, a small cluster of Sorathing cooperative staff moving at the rapid, purposeful pace that species is known for, 2 individuals I could not identify moving in the opposite direction at a distance, their silhouette suggesting a species I had read about but never encountered in person. Everyone in the corridors had an air of purposeful transit, the particular quality of people moving through a large institutional space toward specific, scheduled destinations, as though the station itself imposed a kind of orderly intention on its occupants. The walk to the session chamber took 12 minutes, I counted. The session chamber was exactly as large as the briefing materials had said it was. 60 meters of ceiling, tiered galleries on 3 sides for observer delegations, each gallery fitted with species-appropriate seating, atmospheric conditioning, and translation relay equipment. The chamber floor was a circular space approximately 30 meters across, with a central floor inset, a slightly raised disc of polished pale stone, where the presenting delegation stood during formal session. Around the circumference of the floor, at evenly spaced intervals, were the 11 delegate stations of the Varath Conclave, elevated platforms, each fitted with the administrative apparatus of the relevant species, each occupied by a delegate in full session ceremonial dress. 11 species, 11 platforms, 11 sets of compound eyes or visual analogs tracking us as we walked through the main doors. Bren murmured very quietly that it was a nice room. I said it was adequate. He gave me a sideways look that meant he had registered I was managing something and was letting me manage it. The chirarch of the Varath Conclave was the delegate at the central station, directly opposite the entry, Chirarch Selveth. I had read the chirarch's file. She was, by Varath reckoning, approximately 215 years old, which is middle-aged for a Varath, and she had served as chirarch for 31 of those years. Her carapace overlays were the most elaborate in the chamber, worked and inlaid in a pattern specific to the Clerks rank, with blue spectrum bioluminescent inlays along the dorsal ridge that pulsed slowly at rest. She was, in administrative terms, the most powerful individual in this room, possibly in this sector. She was looking at us with an expression that the briefing materials described as a neutral assessment posture, but which I had come to understand, after 6 days of intensive reading, was in fact the Varith equivalent of finding something unexpected on the bottom of your shoe. She said, translated, that the conclave welcomed the human representation. She said she noted that the human delegation had arrived. She said this in a tone that the translator rendered as neutral, but that the surrounding acoustics suggested contained a harmonic overtone the translator was declining to convey, which is a thing that happens sometimes with Varith speech. The full harmonic range of Varith communication carries things that don't have direct translation equivalents. One of them is a quality sometimes described as ceremonial surprise, which is the polite, formal version of a laugh. Bren said that he was attaché first class Bren Hollowell, and that I was his administrative aide, warrant officer second class Deva Osai, and that we were the complete representation of Earth's diplomatic mission. There was a sound in the chamber that the translator did not render. It came from several of the gallery tiers simultaneously. I kept my face neutral. Clerks Selveth said, translated, that the conclave was prepared to proceed. She said this in a way that was correct and courteous, and that still managed to communicate the subtext that the conclave was very generously prepared to proceed with what appeared to be a clerical error masquerading as a delegation, and that everyone in the room understood this and had agreed not to say so out loud, which was in itself a kind of institutional courtesy that one extended to smaller, less developed species. I noted, in the part of my mind where I stored things to think about later, that she had said administrative aid. The standard title for my role in a session context was delegation member. The Clerks had used a different classification, one that in conclave procedural terms carried reduced speaking rights. We had not yet reached the floor inset. I said quietly to Bren that we were going to want to address that before we reached the central floor. He said he was aware. He said I should handle it. I stepped forward slightly, not quite to the floor inset, and spoke to the Clerks directly. I said that I wished to note, for the record, that my role in this delegation was delegation member, not administrative aid, under the charter provisions governing summoned party delegation composition, specifically Article 4, Paragraph 12, Subparagraph C, which defined delegation member as any party authorized to act on behalf of the summoned entity in procedural matters. I said that I was so authorized. I said this in a voice I had spent several years calibrating to a register that was neither aggressive nor apologetic, just clear, just specific, just information. There was a longer pause. The translator registered that pause as silence, which is accurate but incomplete. Clerks Selveth said that the delegation's classification had been noted and would be entered in the session record. She said we might take the floor. We took the floor. The floor inset was smooth under my shoes. From the central disc, looking out at the 11 delegate stations and the tiered galleries, the chamber achieved a specific effect that I suspect was entirely intentional. You felt small. Not unsafe, particularly, but small in the way that a single figure in a large painting feels small, surrounded and dwarfed by the formal architecture of something much older and much larger than itself. I found that I did not mind this feeling. Small is a neutral fact. What you do while you're small is what matters. The session opened with what the conclave called the procedural establishment sequence, which sounds like it might take a few minutes, and in fact takes approximately 40 of them. It involves the formal presentation of credentials, the reading into the record of the session's purpose and scope, the acknowledgement by the summoned delegation of the conclave's authority over the proceedings, and a series of what the Charter calls clarifying inquiries, which are in practice a set of procedural gambits designed to determine how much the summoned party knows about the rules of the game they are currently playing. The first clarifying inquiry came from the delegate of the Keth assemblage, a species that resembles, inadequately described, a very large cephalopod in a pressure suit, with a face arrangement that reads as serene regardless of what they are actually thinking. The delegate of the Keth assemblage inquired whether Earth's delegation was prepared to submit a rank display attestation, as required under Article 9 of the Accord Charter. I said, with respect, that Article 9's rank display requirement applied to delegations appearing in an Accord ceremony of the first category, which this session was not. This was an assessment session, which fell under the second category provisions of Article 9, subsection 4, under which rank display attestation was optional rather than mandatory. The delegate of the Keth assemblage's surface coloration shifted through 2 or 3 shades. The translator rendered its response as an acknowledgement. The second clarifying inquiry came from the delegate of the Sorthing Cooperative. The delegate inquired whether Earth's delegation had filed the appropriate species progress assessment form, known in Conclave administrative parlance as the SPAF-7, prior to the session. I said that the SPAF-7 was a form submitted by delegations requesting an assessment, not by delegations responding to a summons. I said that since Earth had been summoned, not had requested, the SPAF-7 requirement did not apply, as detailed in the procedural guidance attached to the Conclave's own summons documentation, paragraph 14, which the Conclave had itself provided. The delegate of the Sorthing Cooperative made a noise the translator declined to render. The third clarifying inquiry came from the delegate of the Meyerth continuance, a species I can only describe as resembling a mobile architectural column with sensory fronds at the apex, though that description fails to capture the quality of calm, deliberate attention they project. The Meyerth delegate inquired whether Earth's delegation wished to invoke the Observer Protocol, which would allow the delegation to attend the session without speaking rights in exchange for immunity from binding determinations. This was the graceful exit. The Conclave was offering us a door marked "No Harm Done." We could sit in the gallery, observe, and leave without any formal determination being entered. It would be framed as a courtesy. It would also mean that the preliminary assessment, the possible reclassification to candidate species, would proceed on its own schedule, without any substantive response from us on the record today. I said that Earth's delegation was grateful for the offer, but would not be invoking the Observer Protocol. I said we were here to engage with the substance of the session. The Meyerth delegate's sensory fronds moved in a slow, settling pattern. The translator rendered it as acknowledgement, but the movement itself had a quality I had read about, a kind of appreciation for a specific type of answer, one that met the question directly. The Meyerth continuants had their own tradition of administrative precision. They were the second oldest species in the Conclave, and had their own reputation for producing delegates who read documents carefully. The fourth clarifying inquiry came from a smaller delegate near the left arc of the chamber, the delegate of the Herath succession, a species I had less material on than I would have liked, whose members are approximately my height and build, but are covered in a fine, overlapping arrangement of what look like gray-green scales, and who have eyes positioned laterally, giving them a visual field of approximately 270 degrees. The Herath delegate inquired whether the delegation had brought a certified translator on staff, noting that the standard Conclave translation relay might not capture certain nuances relevant to the assessment. This was an interesting gambit. The Conclave translation relay was excellent. It was the standard for all Accord proceedings and had been refined over decades. Raising a question about its adequacy was a way of introducing procedural uncertainty, an implication that something we said might be rendered imprecisely, which could be used later to challenge the record if things went against the Conclave's interests. I said that Earth's delegation was confident in the Conclave's translation relay, which met or exceeded all applicable Accord standards, and that any nuances the relay might not fully capture would be addressed by Earth's delegation, submitting a written version of any formal statements to the session record simultaneously with the oral delivery, which was provided for under Article 11, subsection 2. I said that we would be happy to do so for any statements the Conclave found material. The Herath delegates' lateral eyes oriented briefly in a way that suggested recalibration. The translator rendered its response as acceptance of the proposed arrangement. There were two more clarifying inquiries after that, both fairly standard, both answerable from the charter text without difficulty. By the end of the procedural establishment sequence, 39 minutes from start, I noted, the gallery observers in the nearest tier were no longer making the ambient sounds they had been making at the start, the ones the translator wasn't rendering. The room had gone to a different kind of quiet. The third clarifying inquiry, which had come from the Chirarch herself, landed differently from the others. Chirarch S. Selveth said that the human delegation had impressed the Conclave with its procedural preparation. She said this in a tone that the translator rendered as formal acknowledgement, but that contained, "I had been reading Varath tonal texts for 6 days, a quality of recalibration. Something had been expected that had not materialized. She was adjusting." She said that the Conclave would now proceed to the substantive business of the session. She said that the purpose of this assessment session was to review Earth's classification under the Vethek Accord framework, with particular attention to whether Earth's current classification as a provisional associate, the lowest tier classification available under the Accord, remained appropriate, or whether that classification should be revised. She did not specify in which direction. Bren, standing beside me, was very still. I was also still. I had known this was coming. It was in the session preamble we had received with the summons, but knowing a thing intellectually and standing on a stone floor 60 meters below a ceremonial ceiling, while 11 species delegates look at you, are two different experiences. I let both of them be true at the same time and kept my face neutral. The Chirarch said that the Conclave's preliminary assessment, based on the standard indicators, suggested that Earth's current classification warranted review, and that the review might indicate that reclassification to candidate species status was appropriate. Candidate species status is lower than provisional associate, considerably lower. Under candidate species status, Earth would retain a physical presence at the station, but would lose its speaking rights in all Accord proceedings, its access to Accord commercial and transit frameworks, and its representation in the administrative registry. It would, in practical terms, be demoted from the lowest level of the hierarchy to a sub-level below the hierarchy. The chamber was very quiet. Bren said that Earth's delegation acknowledged the Conclave's preliminary assessment. I appreciated that about him. He knew when to say exactly what the protocol required and nothing else. The Chirarch said that the Conclave would hear from the delegation before proceeding to its determination. This was, per the charter, the summoned party's formal opportunity to respond. It was also, per the 6 days of reading I had done, the point in the session where most delegations either capitulated or mounted a defense that the Conclave's superior procedural knowledge would systematically dismantle. The Conclave had been doing this for 400 years. They knew how to structure an assessment so that the summoned party's options were limited by the time the formal response period arrived. I knew all of this. I also knew something the Chirarch did not know I knew. Bren looked at me. I gave him a small nod. He said that the delegation's substantive response would be provided by Warrant Officer Osai. I stepped forward slightly on the floor inset, not dramatically, not performatively, just functionally, and addressed the Chirarch directly. I said that Earth's delegation appreciated the Conclave's careful review and agreed that the question of Earth's classification was worth examining thoroughly. I said that before responding to the substance of the Conclave's preliminary assessment, the delegation wished to place a document in the session record. I said this was a standard procedure under Article 11 of the Accord Charter, which provided that a summoned delegation might introduce documentary evidence at any point in the formal response period, and that such documents became part of the session record and were subject to the Conclave's interpretive authority. The Chirarch said that the delegation might proceed. I opened my document case. The document I removed was printed on standard Earth diplomatic stationery, plain white, text in both standard Accord script and English, header identifying it as a submission from the Office of Interspecies Liaison. It was 4 pages long. I walked to the chamber floor's edge and placed it in the document reception slot at the base of the nearest Conclave delegate station, which fed directly into the session record system. A soft chime indicated it had been received and entered. I said that the document in question was an analysis of Earth's classification history under the Vethek Accord framework, covering the period from initial provisional associate classification to the present. I said that the analysis identified what the delegation believed was an administrative anomaly in Earth's classification record. I said, and I chose the word anomaly carefully because it was neutral. It was not an accusation. It was not a challenge. It was a word that implied something had simply gone wrong in the paperwork, which could happen to anyone, which was, in fact, exactly what it implied, that the anomaly related to the application of Article 7, Paragraph 3 of the Accord Charter's classification criteria. I gave that a moment. Article 7, Paragraph 3 was not an obscure provision. It was one of the foundational classification criteria, one of the oldest strata in the document architecture, predating most of the subsequent procedural accretion by approximately 200 years. It specified the threshold requirements for full Accord member status, not provisional associate, not candidate species, but full member, in terms of a species' demonstrated capacity for interstellar trade, independent navigation of Accord-registered transit corridors, and maintenance of at least one permanent off-world installation. I said that by the delegation's analysis, Earth had met all 3 criteria specified in Article 7, Paragraph 3. I said that Earth had met them for approximately 11 years. I said that the delegation would welcome the Conclave's review of the attached analysis, and that if the Conclave concurred with the delegation's findings, the delegation looked forward to discussing the administrative steps required to bring Earth's classification into alignment with the criteria it had already satisfied. I stopped speaking. The chamber was silent in a different way than it had been silent before. The previous silences had been formal, the silence of procedure, of established ritual, of a system processing inputs in the order it was accustomed to processing them. This silence had a different quality. It was the silence of 11 sets of eyes and their various analogs all doing the same rapid calculations simultaneously and arriving at the same result at approximately the same time. Chirarch Selveth had not moved. Her bioluminescent dorsal inlays, which had been pulsing slowly throughout the session, had stopped. She said, translated, "Repeat the article reference." I said Article 7, Paragraph 3. She said, translated, "The 3rd paragraph." I said yes. There was a period of time in which things happened administratively that I was not directly party to. I could see the delegates at their stations consulting their apparatus, which in Varath design is a semi-organic relay system that looks from a distance like a curved structure of pale filaments extending from the delegate platform to a central processing node. The filaments were active, all of them from all 11 stations. The chamber had the quality of a very large room full of people who had simultaneously discovered a figure in the margin of a document they had all agreed was already finalized. The delegate of the Keth assemblage spoke. The translator rendered it as, "The delegation's citation refers to the foundational criteria as originally drafted." I said yes. The delegate said, "These criteria have not been amended since the original drafting." I said that was correct. The delegate was quiet for a moment. Its surface coloration moved through several shades in a way that the briefing materials described as a contemplative sequence. The Myerth delegate's sensory fronds were active, not the slow, settling movement from earlier but a rapid, precise orientation, pointing toward the central processing node of the delegate apparatus, which meant the Myerth delegate was cross-referencing in real time. The Myerth continuance had a reputation, within the conclave, for being the species most likely to find an error in a document and least likely to be pleased about it. Their legal tradition was 460 years old. They took document integrity seriously in the way that some species take territorial disputes seriously. Another delegate, the one from the Myerth continuance, inquired, translated, whether the delegation was suggesting that Earth's classification had been applied in error for an extended period. I said the delegation was not suggesting anything. The delegation had introduced a document for the conclave's review. The conclave's interpretive authority was supreme in such matters. The delegation had every confidence in the conclave's ability to review the document and determine its own conclusions. I said this with complete sincerity, which was easy because it was true. The conclave's interpretive authority was indeed supreme, and the conclave's conclusions, once they reviewed the document and confirmed what I knew they would confirm, because I had spent 6 days making sure of it, were going to be that Earth had been misclassified. Not by malice. This was important. I had been very careful in how I framed the document and in how I framed my remarks to ensure that nothing in the presentation implied malice or negligence on the part of any conclave member or the conclave's administrative process. The word anomaly had been chosen for exactly this reason. Anomalies happen in large, complex, 400-year-old document architectures. They are nobody's fault. They are, in fact, the kind of thing a well-functioning administrative body is grateful to have identified and corrected, because the alternative, an error persisting in the record, is worse. I had read enough conclave administrative history to know that the conclave valued its own procedural integrity above almost everything else. Not pride, not dominance, procedural integrity, the correctness of the record. A misapplied classification, once identified, was something that needed to be corrected, because a classification system with known errors was a classification system that did not function. And a classification system that did not function was the one thing the conclave could not tolerate. I was, in other words, not beating them. I was handing them something that served their interests as much as mine, wrapped in the correct language, in the correct format, with the correct citations. That was, in retrospect, the thing the conclave had not anticipated. They had set up the session expecting a delegation that was either ignorant of the process, in which case the session would be brief and uncomfortable for us, or combative about the process, in which case the session would be long and uncomfortable for both parties and the conclave would still prevail. They had not anticipated a delegation that had read the foundational charter and brought them a document that made the conclave's own procedural integrity the argument. There is no good countermove to that in a bureaucratic framework. Not if you are an institution that exists to uphold the integrity of its own documents. The chirarch spoke. She said, translated, that the conclave would take a recess to review the submitted document. She said the session would resume in 3 hours. She did not say anything else. She did not look at us again before the recess was called. The escorts took us to a waiting area adjacent to the chamber, a room designed for species with our approximate atmospheric and thermal requirements, with furniture that was almost right, in the way that furniture designed to accommodate multiple species is usually almost right for any specific one. There was water. There were surfaces to sit on. Bren sat down. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said that had been well played. I said I'd just read the documents. He said that was what he meant. I said I was going to see if there was anything to eat. There wasn't, but there was something that appeared to function as a nutrition dispenser, and it offered 8 options, of which 3 were listed as compatible with human biochemistry. I selected one at random. It tasted approximately like crackers that had been near something with an opinion about herbs. It was fine. We waited. I had thought I might be nervous during the recess, but I found that I wasn't. There was nothing left to do that I could do. The document was in the record. The conclave was reviewing it. The analysis was correct. I had checked it against the charter text 4 times, and I had had Bren check it twice, and we had both come to the same conclusion independently before I had even mentioned it to him. The foundational criteria in Article 7, Paragraph 3 were what they were. Earth had a permanent off-world installation, the Callahan Station at L2, operational for 14 years. Earth had maintained independent navigation of Accord-registered transit corridors. Our commercial vessels had been using the Accord transit network for 11 years under the Provisional Associate Access Tier. Earth had established interstellar trade relationships, the mineral exchange agreements with the PETH Consortium, the navigation data sharing arrangement with the Meyerth Continuance, and 3 other formal commercial agreements, all logged in the Accord's own registry. What I was doing during the recess was thinking about what the conclave was doing. They had 3 hours. In those 3 hours, they would be doing several things simultaneously. They would be verifying my citations, confirming that Article 7, Paragraph 3 said what I said it said, and that the criteria were unamended. That verification would not take long. They would be checking Earth's classification record against the foundational criteria, which would take somewhat longer but would produce the same result I had produced. And then, the longer process, they would be having an internal discussion about what to do with that result. The conclave had 400 years of institutional memory about how to handle difficult procedural situations. They also had 400 years of institutional memory about how to handle situations that required maintaining the integrity of their own record. Those 2 imperatives were not always compatible, and when they conflicted, the record tended to win. That was not a universal truth of bureaucratic institutions, but it was a specific truth of the Vareth Conclave, which was why I had framed the document the way I had framed it. Give the institution a path that serves its own stated values, and you remove most of the friction. What remained was face, and face was manageable if you were careful about the language. 11 years, not a close call, not a borderline case that required interpretive generosity. A clear, documented, verifiable satisfaction of explicit criteria that had been sitting in the foundational charter since before any of the current conclave delegates had taken their seats. The fact that nobody had noticed it sooner was, in practical terms, an artifact of how the classification review process worked. The conclave reviewed provisional associate classifications on a rotating schedule, and Earth's review had come up at a time, this particular session, when the conclave had assembled its preliminary assessment using the current tier criteria, which was standard practice, rather than the foundational criteria, which would only be consulted if someone specifically raised the question. Someone had now specifically raised the question. Bren asked at some point during the 2nd hour how I had found it. I said it was in the index. He said which index? I said the Master Classification Index, cross-referenced against the foundational charter provisions, which was the document cross-referencing project I had been doing on the Tuesday when he came to my door. He looked at me for a moment. He said that he had assigned me that project 8 months ago. I said yes. He said that I had found this 8 months ago. I said I had flagged it as a potential anomaly in the supplemental notes attached to the cross-reference file, which he had received in the standard filing cycle. I said the flag had been in the third supplemental note of the October cycle, under the heading Pending Further Review, subsection Classification Threshold Variance, Foundational Criteria. He repeated that back to himself quietly, as though testing whether it sounded like something he should have read. There was a pause. He said he had assumed the supplemental notes were routine. I said they usually were. I said this particular one had been 6 lines long, which was longer than routine. He said he might read them more carefully in the future. I said that would be a reasonable adjustment. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said that when the session concluded, he was going to recommend me for a classification review of my own. He meant a rank review. I said I appreciated that. He said he meant it. I said I knew. We sat in the near silence of the waiting room for another 40 minutes. At one point, one of the escorts came to the door, looked in at us, and left without saying anything, which I interpreted as the station's way of confirming we hadn't moved. The escorts returned and led us back to the chamber. The change in the room was not dramatic. The conclave delegates were at their stations as before. The galleries held the same observer complement. The ceiling was still 60 meters high, but something in the atmosphere of the room had shifted in the way that a room shifts when the people in it have spent 3 hours reaching a conclusion they did not expect to reach and have now finished arguing about it and are in the phase of accepting it. Clerks Selveth's bioluminescent inlays were active again. The slow pulse had a slightly different rhythm than it had before the recess, marginally quicker, the way a heartbeat quickens under some mild but sustained stimulation. We took the floor inset. The Clerk said that the conclave had reviewed the submitted document. She said that the conclave had reviewed it against the relevant sections of the Accord Charter and the classification record as filed. She said that the conclave found the delegation's analysis to be, in the main, procedurally sound. She said this the way you say something that is accurate and that you would have preferred not to say, but that the record required, and that you were therefore saying because the record was more important than your preference. She said that the conclave had identified certain questions regarding the application of the foundational classification criteria to Earth's case that warranted additional administrative review before any determination was made. I noted the hedge. Additional administrative review could mean anything from a week to 7 years, depending on the conclave's inclination. I had anticipated this. It was the conclave's standard procedural buffer, a way of acknowledging that a point had been made without committing immediately to all of its implications. I said respectfully that the delegation understood the conclave's position and supported the conclave's prerogative to conduct whatever additional review it found necessary. I said that the delegation simply wished to note, for the record, that as of this session, the foundational criteria question had been formally raised, formally received into the session record, and formally acknowledged by the conclave as warranting review. I said that the delegation looked forward to the outcome of that review. I said that the delegation would be available for any follow-up inquiries the conclave's administrative staff required, and would respond to formal correspondence within the standard window. I stopped speaking. The Clerk looked at me for a long moment. In Varith visual anatomy, the compound eye clusters do not have pupils in any human sense, and you cannot read direction of focus from them as you would from a human gaze. But there is a quality of stillness that a Varith exhibits when it is paying attention, a slight settling of the carapace's outer surface, a cessation of the small movements of the secondary limbs. Clerks Selveth was exhibiting this quality. She said, translated, the session record will reflect the delegation submissions. She said the session record would reflect the conclave's acknowledgement. She said that the conclave would communicate its determination through the standard administrative channel upon completion of its review. She said this accurately. She said it correctly. She said it without any of the harmonic overtones that the translator had been declining to render during the earlier portion of the session. She said that the conclave thanked Earth's delegation for its attendance. Bren said that Earth's delegation thanked the conclave for its time. We stepped off the floor inset and walked toward the chamber doors. We were almost to the doors when the delegate of the Keth assemblage spoke. The translator caught it and rendered it, a question if the delegation would permit. We stopped. Bren looked at me. I looked at the delegate. The delegate said, the delegation came prepared. It was not phrased as a question, exactly, though it had been introduced as one. It had the quality of an observation that was also an inquiry. I said, we prepared as well as the time allowed. The delegate's surface coloration shifted. The translator did not render the sound it made, but the delegate then said, the conclave will note that in its record also. I said that I appreciated that. We went through the doors. The escort led us back through the station's corridors in the direction of the docking ring, and the corridors were the same as they had been 3 hours earlier. The pale gray composite walls, the cool blue spectrum light, the vast institutional indifference of a place designed to process everything impartially and at great scale. But the walk felt different somehow, not triumphant, not relieved, just slightly more settled, as though we occupied the space with marginally more conviction than we had on the way in. Bren waited until we were through the inner docking gate, out of range of the escorts, before he said anything. He said, you know this isn't over. I said I knew. The additional review could run in any number of directions. The conclave would be thorough, and thorough could produce complications. There would be correspondence. There would probably be follow-up sessions. There would very likely be, at some point, a full conclave procedural review of how Earth's classification had been allowed to stagnate below the foundational criteria for 11 years, and that review would touch on the administrative practices of several parties, and those parties would have their own interests to protect, and those interests would generate additional correspondence. I said we would need more staff. Bren said yes, he had been thinking about that. He said he was going to request 4 additional liaison officers and a dedicated Accord documents analyst. I said that seemed about right. He said he was also going to request the documents analyst be assigned specifically to the Foundational Charter Cross-Reference Project and report directly to me. I said I'd make sure they read the supplemental notes. He made a sound that was approximately a laugh, in the way that something is approximately a laugh when the person making it is tired and relieved, and not entirely sure yet whether to be pleased, because being pleased required confidence that things were going to go the way they appeared to be going. And 11 years of working in interspecies liaison had made us both careful about confidence. The transit back to Earth took 6 days. I spent most of it writing notes. Not a summary of the session. The session record covered that, but a procedural analysis of the conclave's opening gambits. The rank display inquiry, the SBAF7 request, the observer protocol offer, the translation adequacy gambit from the Herath delegate, and the 2 additional clarifying inquiries at the end of the procedural establishment sequence. Each one had been an attempt to either reduce our standing in the proceeding or provide us with a graceful exit that preserved the conclave's preliminary assessment. Each one had been answerable directly from the charter text if you had read the right sections of it. What struck me, working through those notes on the transit home, was how much of the session's opening had been designed around the assumption that we hadn't. Not a hostile assumption, just a reasonable one, based on precedent. Most summoned delegations arrived at Vethek Accord sessions having read the sections they expected to need. The Conclave's clarifying inquiries were calibrated to find the edges of that preparation quickly and establish procedural control before the formal response period. It was a practiced, efficient system. The system assumed you had read some of the documents. It had not been designed for someone who had read all of them. I wrote that up as a preparation guide for whoever came next, because there was going to be a next time. If the Conclave's review went the way I thought it would go, there was going to be quite a lot of next times, and the people going into those sessions were going to need to know that the document architecture rewarded whoever had read all 4 indexing layers simultaneously. I noted that in the guide in fairly plain terms. The Conclave's formal correspondence arrived 14 weeks later. It was addressed to the Office of Interspecies Liaison, Attention Attaché First Class Bren Hollowell, and it was long, 43 pages in the standard Accord format, with 7 appendices. And it said, in the careful, precise, impeccably courteous language of a 400-year-old administrative body that has identified an anomaly in its own records and corrected it. Earth's classification had been reviewed. Earth's classification had been found, under the foundational criteria of Article 7, Paragraph 3, to satisfy the requirements for full Accord member status. Earth's classification was accordingly revised, effective from the date of the session record's formal acknowledgement of the foundational criteria question. The correspondence also noted, in an appendix, that the Conclave had conducted an internal review of its classification procedures and had identified several areas where the automated review process had failed to apply foundational criteria checks appropriately. Revisions to the review process were being implemented. The Conclave thanked Earth's delegation for the contribution its submissions had made to this improvement. I read that appendix twice. They were thanking us for pointing out that their classification system had been running with an unchecked error for 11 years. They were doing it correctly, formally, precisely, with the appropriate procedural language, and the correctness of the form was exactly the point. The record now reflected what the record should always have reflected. The anomaly had been resolved. The system had corrected itself, as a well-functioning system is supposed to do when given accurate information in the correct format. That was all we had done, really, given accurate information in the correct format. I filed the correspondence in the session record, appended my summary notes, and sent the file to Bren with a routing cover that said, simply, reviewed and filed, and recommended for the permanent record. He sent back a message that said, good work. I sent back, I'll start on the appendices. He sent back, I know you already have. I had. There were 7 of them, and 3 contained references to charter provisions I had flagged separately during the preparation period, provisions that had their own cross-referencing implications. It would take a few weeks to work through properly. I opened the first appendix and started reading. Some things are not as complicated as they look. Sometimes a very large room with a very high ceiling is still just a room, and the people in it are still just people, and the document on the table is still just a document, and the question, the only question that actually matters, is whether anyone bothered to read it carefully enough. I had. That was, as far as I could tell, the whole story.